Very good afternoon, and a warm welcome to Shandre University, and particularly to this JCI and JSC seminar on World Economic Outlook. Let me first of all acknowledge the presence of our senior management. The Vice Chancellor is here, Professor Wilkinson, Pro-Chancellor Tan Sri Raymond, and Group CEO for Education Group, Dr. Lee Weng Keng. Thank you for all your support. Let me, as a moderator, take this opportunity to first of all thank Professor Wu for giving me this honor to moderate this panel of very distinguished economists with, who are very outstanding, with vast international and regional experiences as well as extensive research expertise, and then importantly, experience in terms of working with policymakers. Now, with regards to the topic, for the first time since 2009, the IMF in its year forecast has upgraded or revised upwards its forecast for 2017 since 2009. In fact, every consecutive year they have been downgrading the forecast, and for the first time, 2017 has been described as a growth of course we revised upwards from 3.4 to 3.7. It has been described as both broad-based and then importantly synchronized across advanced as well as developing countries. So last year's half a percentage point increase, then in fact marks a very important milestone since the global financial crisis, and both are now experiencing what they call healthy growth with fairly subdued inflation. Now, being a highly open economy, Malaysia, of course, you have seen our export growth rising close to 20% last year. And the good news is that yesterday, trade figures for January was announced and it came out to 17% year-on-year growth. And that has actually exceeded, in fact, most expectations. So being a highly open economy with the global latest indicators pointing to continued expansion, I think there's definitely increased optimism that this momentum will continue for at least for the first half of this year. And of course, if you look at the IMF's forecast, they have upgraded it to 3.9% for 2018 as well as 2019. So with I think 9 years after the global financial crisis and with inflation remaining subdued, the landscape has actually changed quite dramatically, I think. In fact, most economies were caught off guard. So the positive growth environment actually presents an opportunity for Asian countries to reduce the vulnerabilities, to build policy buffers, and then importantly to undertake those difficult structural reforms, and particularly to prepare for the challenges of Industrial Revolution 4.0. So this is a window of opportunity, as well as importantly, we like to discuss what are the current growth prospects, risks, and then importantly, this window opportunity for us to pursue some of the reforms that will lead to what we call sustainable and then importantly, inclusive growth for not just for Malaysia, but also looking at the region, given that our focus, JCI, is actually on Southeast Asia. So today, I'm pleased to invite the first panelist to make his presentation. We have Professor Mohamed Ariff. He's currently a senior fellow at the Jeffrey Chia Institute and both a professor as well as head of the Department of Economics and Finance at Shandre University Business School. Professor Ariff has held full-time positions in various universities such as the National University of Singapore, Monash University, Bonn University, and also University Putra, Malaysia. He has also held fellowship as well as fellow positions in Harvard University, Tokyo University, UCD Dublin, and the University of Melbourne. And also, Professor Ariff has also worked in the Singapore Central Bank. He's an active researcher in financial economics with contributions appearing in numerous international journals on finance and economics. His achievements in publication of research on Islamic finance has earned international recognition, and he manages a conference series named Foundation of Islamic Finance that is held each year in different parts of the world. The conference enters the 10th year in 2018. Professor Mohamed Ariff obtained his PhD from the University of Queensland, Australia, and in 1986, and his MBA from University of Wisconsin-Madison, USA in 1976. without further ado, I'm pleased to invite Professor Ariff to take the floor.
Very good afternoon to all of you. Let me acknowledge my seniors here. My Vice Chancellor is here. Of course, the Pro-Chancellor is here, and also my Dean is somewhere here, I can't see. Thank you for coming. And most of all, thank every one of you for sparing your time to come here. What I'm going to talk about is about currency. When Prof. Wu approached me to take part in this panel, I offered to talk about currency. So I'm going to weave a story to tell where one particular country, Malaysia, stands in terms of relative to the other currencies. Because there are about 47 active currencies, I can't be spending 20 minutes covering all of them. I chose a few of them, and I want to highlight just 4 points. How does the Malaysian ringgit compare with a few selected currencies, importantly, US dollar? And after that, the second thing I want to show you is in terms of changeability, the degree to which the Malaysian currency keeps boiling up and down. We have devised a measure, and I want to show you a chart where you can see how it fares with other currencies. I'm going to call it changeability, but in statistics, we will call it volatility. And then the third thing we want to look at is how risky is this currency relative to other currencies. For that, I choose about 10 different currencies. You can have a look at the numbers. And finally, to ask the question, what are the things that are driving this currency? Of course, what drives currencies are common throughout the world, and therefore the same factors will be affected. So those are the 4 things I want to summarize. Let me start this by first looking at what's happening today. Today at New York fixing, Malaysian ringgit is about, $1 is about 385 ringgit. It works out to about 26 cents for 1 ringgit. If you go back to about a year ago, 7th March, this ringgit was a lot better. In fact, on the 6th of March, 7th of March, it was 4 ringgit 46 per US dollar. So that's the story of ringgit. But from the international perspective, this can happen to any country. So although I'm looking at focusing on Malaysian ringgit, but this can be analyzed for any country. They all undergo same kind of things because currencies are traded every day. The total amount of trade in currency is 5.3 trillion US dollars per day. Of that, actual changing of the dollars and whatever currency you want to change is about $2.3 trillion. It's the biggest financial market in the world. So the good news about the world moving towards a better economic development for the next year means that all these currencies will be relatively moving as well. But I'm telling a story purely from the point of view of Malaysian ringgit. So let me start with that by looking at why do you want to worry about currency? Now, central bank has been around for about 416 years. And we have a vast amount of collective wisdom over the last 416 years. And this collective wisdom says that currency is the actual outcome of how good an economy is being managed. If a currency like the Swiss currency more or less stays very stable against many, many currencies, that is an excellent management of the economy, which is reflected in terms of a stable currency. So the stability of the currency is a test of good economic management, good governance, good skill building. You can say what you like. A whole lot of things goes into that. Therefore, currency is a very important matter. Later on, we will see the collective wisdom also give us some tools to manage currency. Countries that manage the currencies to be stable have managed the currencies using those tools. They're not very complicated. They're very simple. We use them. Since 1984, there's a whole lot of tools that have been developed. So therefore, well-managed economies have stable currency and they are resilient to crisis as well. If I can fast forward this, you can see where the crisis is. You can see there are periods of crisis where the currency go up and down very quickly. 1997 crisis, you can see, is here. I don't know how to point it out there. I can see it here. This 1997, look at how the currencies. If the world is improving, currencies will also will react to that. So obviously, well-managed economies will have stable currencies, which you can see here. British currency, for example, UK pound, one of the world's most stable currency historically, had a very small change, whereas the other currencies bubbled up very much higher. So well-managed economies have good and stable currencies. That's a desirable characteristic of any economy that wants to proceed and develop. Another characteristic of well-managed currency is that if the institutions are built to manage the currency well, when crisis comes, you don't have, bottoms up behavior of the currency. A good example is the 1997-98 that affected about 14 currencies in the region. Most importantly, 5 currencies, including that of Malaysia, but Australian dollar was also affected, but not to the same serious extent because Australians decided in 1984 September to have a free floating of their currency. And that saved them. And they built a whole lot of laws and institutions to ensure that the currency will be freely managed. In fact, it is one of the 11 clean floating, free floating currencies. That saved Australian dollar from buckling up. So while Australian dollar was able to weather the several crises, not only 1997, other crises as well, many others will succumb to crisis. So the second aspect of good currency management for the world economy is that you've got to build institutions and have good currency management. All of us are quite familiar. We are told almost every now and then how bad was 1997. So I don't have to repeat that. It was a global crisis that 5 countries were severely affected, and they all have since recovered from that. A final reason why currency is important is that as we move towards development stages, every 1% decline in currency has 2 effects. One is an immediate downgrading of the per capita income, which means that you are not climbing up the development scale. The second impact is that once the currency depreciates, it has a flow-through effect that takes several months. For example, we measured it, the time to equilibrium for the Malaysian ringgit is something like 12 years, which is a very long time. But some other economies have a quick rebound. It takes about 6 months or 4 months. So there are 2 effects from any depreciation of currency, which is not good for a country that is trying to rise against the development stages. So this is an example of looking at the ringgit from 1990 to year 2018. If you look at the central part, let me explain this graph. This one, there are a couple of graphs here, but they are so small you can't see them. These represent British pound, Filipino peso, so they are not very clear here. This represents the Indonesian rupiah, and this represents US dollar to ringgit, and this represents the Singapore dollars. Now, Singapore dollar is an outlier because Singapore doesn't have material resources. They have always managed currency to appreciate against the rest of the world because 42% of all the inputs in Singapore comes from outside the country. So if your currency appreciates, your input items cost less. So when we were in central bank, I was in central bank in 82, from even that time, they followed a policy of making sure that Singapore dollar appreciates. And there are ways by which you can ensure that appreciation takes place. Switzerland also does the same thing. So that's an outlier. But if you look at Malaysian economy, which is a very large economy, exposed to many forces and a large economy, it perhaps should compare itself with the British pound, which is straight here, and then US dollar. You can see that the Malaysian currency had a severe knock during the crisis, and it also had a severe knock during the 2008 crisis, and then subsequently it is depreciating, particularly from September 2014. But the good news is that with the trade balance improving, trade surplus, the Malaysian ringgit has actually improved from $4.50 somewhere here, around here, and now it's, as of today, it's 384 ringgit to $1 US. So if what Prof has mentioned, if the economy, as trade balances are improving, as it is improving in January, then Malaysian ringgit certainly will be improving from 384 as of today, probably to a much better value. But remember, 380 was the currency control value, put it in September 1998. So if we can reach that level, we are still not improving very much. We are still at the currency control stage. We could improve a lot further, which is something to come in the future. So what I take from here is that countries' currencies, I can plot many other countries, are subject to change during crisis, and when there are crises coming, you got to have good currency management in order for you to handle crisis well without spilling over effect of the currency. So that's the first lesson we have to remember. Now the second one is how changeable is Malaysian currency. I could do it for Indonesian rupiah. I have done it for 12 Islamic countries and presented at the World Bank meeting just last year. So we can do that. I'm just taking Malaysia as an example. It appears that good monetary policy achievements of the Central Bank of Malaysia has kept inflation very low. One of the few countries in the world where the inflation has been kept under 4% for almost 40 years. This is a great achievement. Central Bank has done a great job, BNM. Similarly, it has periodically prevented hot money from entering Malaysia. And that's a very difficult task, because if you let the hot money to enter the Malaysian market, then it will bring money supply increases, which in turn, within a few months, will result in higher inflation, then the interest rate will go up. It's a vicious cycle. So they have done a great job. But when it comes to targeting ringgit, it has not been a great job. It deserves some much more challenging refocus. So in the last slide, we saw that UK pound and Filipino peso maintain the value. So those two central banks are doing a great job. I could put Switzerland, it will give you the same result. So countries that have good institution, good currency management, tend to have very stable currencies. But against the US dollar, which matters because Malaysia is the sixth largest trading country adjusted for the size of the economy. So we are exposed to the whole world. We are not like countries like, let's say, Nepal, which is not exposed to many countries. So in a sense, our Malaysian ringgit will have all kinds of bad weathers and good weather affecting us. And in that situation, we have to have a better management of the currency. To look at how this can be elaborated or measured, what we did, we have been doing work on this for the last 6 years, we try to look at it in a different way. It's a very simple idea. If you want to look how you are behaving, you got to compare with your competitor or the target that matters. For the currency, the target that matters is US dollar, because 67% of all international billing and payment is in US dollar, and Malaysia cannot escape that. So therefore, our target should be relative to US, how are we doing? So to do that, we looked at the changeability of the Malaysian ringgit by looking at the, I don't want to get technical here, just looking at the volatility, how much change Malaysian ringgit has against US dollar. But we did one more improvement. We hold the US dollar values stable. And that's a straight line you can see. You can see a blue straight line going from here to there. What we have done is we have taken the changeability of the US dollar, divide by the changeability value of the US dollar. Therefore, it must give you a value of 1. So that's the benchmark. And then we plot whichever currency we want, and we can see that the Malaysian ringgit is here, particularly during the Asian financial crisis. You can see how badly it got out of control. We lost control of the ringgit. But even in 2008 crisis, there is some loss of control. But more importantly, I want to show you how that behavior is taking place. It's not very clear. I'm sorry about it. But if you follow the line there, the very blue line, the blue line is for the Sing dollar, and the orange line is for the US dollar. Sorry, not US dollar. US dollar is the straight line. So let's now concentrate on the Malaysian ringgit, which I have labeled there. I didn't see it earlier. So that's one. Let's follow that. So if you look at that red line, the red line is here. This is a period from 1990. You can see that it's doing very well. In fact, pretty much well, but the financial crisis jolted us, but we gained control over it. And again, it's perfectly all right, because this is a period of currency control. Once the currency control is removed, this period here, currency control was eased slowly. Then you can see that the currency started to worsen. The movement is upward, meaning that you have to pay more to buy a foreign currency. So the volatility is getting increased. This is the second aspect. The volatility is increased, and it doesn't come down at all as it has been in the earlier period before 1996. And I'm going to characterize the earlier period as a period where the following three things were observable. The currencies were holding at 2.50 ringgit per US dollar. Second thing, with tremendous trade surplus, because the economy is growing at 7.5 to 8%. And thirdly, there was surplus budget. Three important drivers were helping the Malaysian ringgit to actually appreciate against the world currency, US dollars. But the Asian crisis jolted us. We gained control of it through the currency control, but subsequent to that, 2005 onwards, there have been two new governments, and during that period, we have worsening behavior in terms of increased changeability, increased volatility. So the second lesson we note from this basic analysis is that not only the value of ringgit has worsened, but concurrently, the volatility has also increased, which means the dangerous thing is something becoming out of control. You can see the volatility. This is huge volatility that you lost control. But you didn't lose control here, but still volatility has increased, which means you are not fully in control. I dare not want to say this because I need to do more work. If the management of the currency has been successful, like in the case of Switzerland and Australia, you wouldn't see this graph behaving like that. The volatility will be subdued. So one could easily conclude, and I need more proof on that there is a loss of control on the management of Malaysian ringgit. But that needs to be further explored. That's the second thing I want to say. Now I want to move on to the third item. Now the third item is how risky is Malaysian currency in relation to other currencies. Now there are many ways of benchmarking currency risk. I want to use a simple idea of what we call, if you take the changeability of anything, it could even be changeability of floodwaters, doesn't matter. Then we can find out that there is a kind of a quality control between one quartile and the third quartile. It's called the interquartile range, very widely used in sciences. So if you use the interquartile range of volatility, it benchmarks the currency in terms of its what I would call riskiness. But there are other riskiness. We can use country risk. We are doing some work on country risk, which we can confirm in another meeting. So what we did was to look at the degree of riskiness and our assumption is that a less risky a currency, more stable it is. And that's a desirable characteristic of an economy. More risky a currency, the greater is the instability. So if we can show that country X has got lower risk, then means it's a desirable thing. If it's a higher value, then it's not a desirable thing. We got to start beginning to control it. Supposing we make the US dollar constant, and then we can compare that with the rest of it. That's what we did in the second idea I presented. And this is what we found out. It's a little bit small. Let me explain. Malaysia is highlighted there as a little bit bolder numbers here. The unit of unit value, the mean, the average of the riskiness as measured by the riskiness measure is approximately 0.8. Now you move back. I purposely took developing countries just to show some of these countries are comparable in size. Iran is a large economy. Iran since 2005 is not a reliable indicator because it's suffering from lots of sanctions. But before that, it's okay. Morocco is a big economy. So is Nigeria, so is Pakistan, and so on. Turkey is also a developing country. So if you look at it, you can see that Turkey is the worst in terms of riskiness, 3.03. Compared to Malaysia, it's about 4 times risky in terms of currency riskiness. But if you look at countries like Bangladesh, something to be envied, is only 0.20. I mean, it's about 4 times less risky than Malaysia, and almost 12 times to 14 times less than Turkey. So we can look at where the behavior that we have just observed comes from. It comes from the fact that there's a lot of riskiness in the way the currency is turning out to behave. But one can also say currency is being managed. Failure to manage, if Switzerland can do it, even Singapore can do it, or some other countries can do it. For example, Turkey managed to get its worst behavior corrected for a short period when they changed the central bank governor there was a guy who was studying in NYU, Mustafa Gultekin, and he was a PhD in finance. And that guy was recruited after he worked in the US. And he then made the Turkish currency very, very stable. And that was many years ago, before the rise of the current prime minister. So countries can manage currencies very well using a battery of tools that's today available, given the wisdom of 400 years of central bank. So this is something that was surprising to me, that there is so much riskiness in this currency. So we can then conclude, we show riskiness of selected currencies. It appears from the table on the next page. We have just seen that. In spite of all the reputation, the monetary targeting is a success for inflation. They also claim risk reduction and so on. It has not been seen in the way the currency is behaving, particularly since 2005, not before that. Okay? And ringgit ranks among the high-risk currencies among the developing countries. Currency risk needs to be a focus for sustainable economic management. And the last point, this is where I got to spend a few minutes. I'm still having time, no problem. I think Prof would bear with me very quickly. Now, we know from both economic theories and practice, this is not, economics often is, described as a dismal science. It's not true. A lot of things that economic theory says are being tested in the real world. Central banks practice some of the theories. Now, we know what drives currencies, and that's the last point I want to make. Now, there are just merely, I have put in here 5 key variables. We can add 1 or 2 more. We know that these drivers actually drive the currency. So what about the future? We got to now focus on how to manage those drivers. If you manage the drivers, then the currency will become stable, and therefore currency will not be hurting the economy. So monetary theories clearly show drivers of currency that is being put into practice. These are at the center of monetary policy to manage not just inflation, but also currencies. Okay? Those of us who are exposed to this, we know that if you control inflation and make it stable, that's good. And Malaysia has done it. Excellent job. 40 years of stable inflation. Stable real interest rate. Yes, that too Malaysia has done. But because Malaysia is a net importer of capital, the amount of interest is slightly higher than what you find in major countries. And therefore, there's always a premium, and that's the reason why hot money flows into Malaysia. And the central bank have a big task of keeping it away. But in spite of that, they have done a good job. Interest rate has been reasonably stable. You don't have for example, Indonesia today, the basic interest rate is almost 12%. Imagine, you got to borrow money to buy a house. You're talking about 25% interest rate. Nobody can afford to buy a house in that case. The other thing is balanced budget. We saw 2005 onwards, there's a depreciation of the currency. We also know that the balanced budget was not there right from the time the financial crisis struck and still going on. 6.7% deficit, current budget, it has been reduced to a lot less than that. So we are in the good direction. Productivity is known to be another driver. And we know that the productivity of the workforce is not as high as some of the high productivity countries, but productivity is a very complex area. It depends on the education, skill training, and technology, and so on. It's a long-term objective. And trade surplus, which Prof hinted, is another important thing. Malaysia has gone through a bad patch of 2.5 years of bad trade growth, and you suffered. But the economy has improved, trade balance is improving. So these are the drivers on which policies have to be fine-tuned to make sure that we bring back the Malaysian ringgit to be more stable. Therefore, authorities should take targeting currency stability as well as inflation, as do several countries. Singapore, Switzerland, and a few other countries target currency as well as inflation. You got to do both. We can do that by sterilizing methods. It is possible to move ringgit to have less relative volatility, and that's what the central message of my paper. Thank you very much for giving me the time.
I think Prof. Ariff has touched upon a very important topic, particularly for this year, which is actually the return of financial market volatility. I think one way to think about how these currencies matters in macroeconomic management is actually what they call the trinity, the impossible trinity, the trilemma faced by policymakers, in the sense of you can only have two policy objectives out of three, which is actually free markets in terms of capital flows, financial independence. That means you have control over your interest rate, or you can have control over your exchange rate. So you cannot have one. You cannot have three altogether. You have to have only one that allows you to manage that. So Malaysia, we have actually focused a lot on monetary policy because we have control of that. But more recent studies have actually shown that financial stability is becoming a more important aspect because of globalization of the financial markets. And to that, I think we have added one more dilemma. There's a quadramma. That means four. Therefore, you have to strike a balance. Let's move on to the next speaker. Let me introduce Professor Shandre Thangavelu. He's the Vice President of Jeffrey Chia Institute on South Asia, one of our colleagues. Before his appointment recently, he was the Regional Director at the Center for International Economic Studies at the Institute of International Trade in the University of Adelaide, and also the Director of the Asia Growth Research Center at that same university. Professor Shandre is also a research fellow at the Helm Center for Research on Globalization and Economic Policy, the University of Nottingham. He is also a member of the governing board for the Work Safety Health Institute of Singapore, and also a member of the Competition Commission Appeal Board in Singapore. Professor Shandre was the Managing Director for the Asia Economic Journal in 2009, and he's currently was appointed as an editor in 2018. He is also a fellow of Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia, EREA, in 2017. Professor Shandre is a very active researcher on human capital development, technology transfer, foreign direct investment, trade, government, infrastructure, productivity, and economic growth. And that's entirely, we have a first speaker, Professor Ariff, talking about financial sector. Now we have a real sector economies. He has written extensively on ASEAN integration, FDI, human capital development, technology transfer, and he has written several books on trade, investment, integration, and outsourcing in Asia. He has also worked on several international projects commissioned by UNDP, World Bank, ASEAN Secretariat, APEC, as well as the Asian Productivity Organization. Professor Shandre obtained his graduate degrees from Queen's University in Canada. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Shandre to make his presentation.
Thank you, Prof. Wu, for inviting me, and the Sunway University for inviting me. We do this. Most academics put in big profile so that we get high salary. So that's exactly what I did. Anyway, what I want to talk about was about the world, how the world is going to be, more from the ASEAN perspective, and then I will have three dimensions. One is I will talk about where we are. Second dimension, I will talk about what the future holds for us, and in the medium term, not the long run, but medium term, and which means that most economists, when they say medium term, it can be up to 10 years. My medium term is quite nearby. It's around maybe 2020, 25. It's around, we're quite close to us. And I will, normally when I do presentation, I'll focus on key ideas. And I will talk about trade, technology, and human capital, how they are all related together, and how they will determine how we're going to move from here. And some key observations in 2017, and we are only beginning of 2018, as Prof. Thye has mentioned, that there is a synchronized growth. And the synchronized growth, global synchronized growth, is generally driven by US and also by Europe recovering. And Europe itself, even with the Brexit, Europe is still showing a lot of growth momentum. And US is showing a very strong growth momentum, irrespective of what Trump does. And which means that a good example is the stock prices have increased quite strongly. That means most of the wealth in companies has increased quite a bit, and that has a lot of implication for exchange rate, for how business is going to invest in the future. And in line with this is one of the concerns we had with the US stock price going up is also the housing prices going up together with the stock prices. And that trend, we saw that during the global financial crisis. So we also saw a strong housing price pickup in US. And the other important dimension that is added to this is in the positive growth is also the growth of Japan. After decades of no growth, Japan is showing positive growth. Even in Japanese context, you have 1 or 2% growth, or between 1 to 2. It is very significant for us and very significant for Japan. And long period of stagflation, that means deflation is driving them. It seems like they're showing a lot of traction. That is important. And ABA economics, although ABA has launched the third arrow, it seems like there's some traction is going on, and which is very important for us. Japan is very critical for us, not only from the economic sense, but also from the political economy sense. I will explain. China is rebalancing between 7 to 6%, and that is very good for us because China was overheating and it was managed very well, actually, without serious social unrest. And that is good for us because we still want China to grow and to be an important part. And in fact, I will argue after the speech by the Chinese premier, they are setting themselves for the next stage of a very important growth, which is going to be very innovative and very value-added activities, which is again in line with the One Belt, One Road initiative which they have, and how they're moving their resources around the global region itself. And it's also interesting to see China and East Asia is now championing trade as opposed to US and Europe. So there's a general shift in the way, the philosophy of thinking about trade itself. And this is also interesting that you don't need to be a completely democratic country to actually drive trade. You can be a socialist or centrally managed economy, and you can have high level of growth. So again, the kind of institutional arrangement we had and what they taught me when I was in a graduate school is a little bit different in terms of how trade and trade growth is managed. And the other thing we also see in Asia is we are observing a lot of investment that's going to infrastructure, a lot of investment. And if you go to Cambodia 10 years ago and now, you see a lot of infrastructure is driving them. And this infrastructure is driven by the private sector and also by, not by aid, by Chinese investment and Japanese investment. That is the One Belt, One Road is hitting us very strongly, and that's a good thing because we really need infrastructure. And ASEAN connectivity that's driven by ADB and the Japanese also driving this. So what we're talking about fast trains in Indonesia, supported by the Chinese, and also for another fast lane supported by the Japanese. And the railroad investment from China linking up to Laopedia, and highways investment by China in Cambodia, and even Chinese investment, land bridges going from China all the way to Europe. Those things are also running through. So we're seeing parallel in infrastructure, not just hard infrastructure, but also a lot of soft infrastructure is going to Asia, which means that the idea of positive impact of growth is going to be very important for us. That's going to liberalize and empower a lot of things to move. People are going to move, goods going to move, we're going to see a lot of new cities going to emerge, and we're going to see interesting future for the young people. So it's very positive for us in 2018. So 2018, with whatever Trump is going to do, we're still going to see positive growth, and fairly we are preparing ourselves to go to the next phase of growth. It's very positive, I would say, and very stable, because as the chairman for the session already indicated that the growth, they already highlighted the growth, is real growth because inflation is subdued. We're not seeing inflation. In fact, that's a good thing. So we actually really experiencing real growth. But whether the real growth translates to a real wage growth, that's another institutional issue that we need to follow up with that. Real growth is important, but real wage growth is equally important for me. So that I have not seen yet. So it's robust, stable, and I'm still very cautiously optimistic that I want to see the distributional effects on that. And China is expected to grow in 27. It grew very well, and it's going to stabilize 6.4, which is good for us. It's not going to collapse. So it's going to be, China is going to have a good growth momentum. Again, these numbers are not mine. These numbers come from ADB. As you can see, fairly the forecast for 2018 is going to be pretty good across most countries. In fact, most countries are going to show positive growth, and even Singapore, Malaysia, although we trend down in terms of growth, but it's still within a reasonably potential level. Except for Singapore, potential is a little bit higher. Okay, and in terms of US, this is what you call synchronized growth. Everybody is growing pretty well, so things looks pretty okay at the moment. There are three different dimensions that I want to talk about. One is trade and technology. And this is interesting. Trump has exited out of TPP 12, and then we have TPP 11. So he managed it very well. Now Trump started his protectionism. He imposed tariff on steel and aluminum. So there will be a tariff war. But again, given the fundamentals, we still will grow. But behind this is another dimension. Because of the stock price going up and housing price going up, the stock market adjusted early in the year. Because the new Federal Reserve chairman is a hawk, so he will increase the interest rate to cool the economy down. So if Trump pushing this, he's not going to increase the interest rate. So fairly, you will counteract that. But the impact of interest rate and protectionism is completely different. So protectionism is a more global impact in nature. So fairly, I think ASEAN will survive, I think. But there will be a slowdown in US and Europe a little bit. But we hope that there will be some kind of adjustment that takes place. But the TPP 11 is very important for us because Malaysia, Singapore, Brunei, and Vietnam are in that. And that has a very strong dimension for the future. Why? The e-commerce dimension and the future technology, how we're going to structure adjust the future technology was in TPP 11. So I was very happy that they managed to salvage the TPP and made it what you call CPTPP. And in fact, the CPTPP has increased our dimension a little bit better. In fact, when US exited from TPP 12, we were quite upset, and most countries were quite upset, especially Vietnam, because they want to use that for structural adjustment. But now they are quite happy because now US imposed protectionism. So can you imagine they are in TPP 12 and impose protectionism? they will make the whole trade agenda collapse, even more severe for us. So we are quite happy that CPTPP was fairly in context. But it's also has created another dimension. It allow other countries to join, which means that Korea have expressed to join after they sign. Indonesia initially expressed, now is also interested to join. And other ASEAN countries might also join CPTPP. And there's also a dimension of China joining CPTPP. That has not been ruled out. And there is some studies already been done because without US, China might take some interest in CPTPP. So again, the momentum of trade is counteract both what protectionism plus what CPTPP is going to do. But at the same time, RCEP, that's a regional economic cooperative partnership that includes ASEAN plus the 6 countries, also come into place. And there's a difference between CPTPP and RCEP. CPTPP is a trade agreement, so it brings a lot of trade countries together. Initially, the center was US, but now the center is trade, not US, trade itself. And that's a good thing for us, for Singapore and Malaysia, and ASEAN itself, because trade is what drives us, not US. So US has their own political agenda anyway, so which allow us to seriously think how to move trade and the trade agenda for the new age FTA, that's what I call. So that will be very interesting for us, which put a momentum on RCEP to push, not go for the minimum level of agreement, but the high level of agreement. And the regional agreement is exactly what it means. If I don't have a map, I used to have a map. If I look at a map, it's a regional integration. RCEP is a regional integration. It brings 16 countries together. That's where one belt, one road, and ASEAN connectivity has the greatest impact on us. They link everybody together. That's a regional integration. It's different from a trade integration, trade agreement. So in the future, we think that RCEP and TPP will be merged at the APEC level. And we're already working on that agenda itself. So which means that we're going to form a big bloc. And the reason why we kept it alive is also for US and Trump to come back. And this price here and so on. But there is some rumor within the political network that to keep it alive so that US can come back into TPP. But of course, who's going to make the first move is good for us. Either China makes the first move or US going to make the first move. So in fact, US is worse off by not being in that one. And interestingly, the trade is being championed for the CPTPP is championed by Japan because they become stronger. Australia, again, is good for us because Australia in Pacific and closer to us. New Zealand, and to some extent indirectly by China by pushing the RCEP agenda. So again, the other thing, interesting part is why is very robust and very positive because our middle income is growing very fast. And the other agenda for us in 2018 is a lot of free trade agreements or ASEAN Plus One agenda is coming into negotiation, especially the UNFTA. So what is UNFTA? UNFTA is the ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand free trade agreement. It's very important because that free trade agreement, among all the free trade agreement, give us a lot of externalities because it emphasizes on trade and services. So that is trade. Trade is going to dominate a lot of things in 2018, 2019 to going to 2024. The other thing that's going to dominate us is service sector. And service sector and servicification of activities is going to dominate us. And the interesting part of manufactured good and servicification is that services are driven by human beings. So production can be driven by processes. So which means that it will have a lot of impact on all of us. So I'm quite happy to see young people and old people. So it will have a lot of impact on all of us. So that is one important dimension that's going to take place. And service activities already increased across ASEAN. The share is increasing. And which means there are several dimensions. Traditionally, we think that manufacturing supports services. That means we have services, and we, as manufacturing grow, we liberalize manufacturing, then we worried about services. And most of our FTAs, whatever trade negotiation, trade policies, or even industrial policies, are only targeted at manufacturing activities. But increasingly, when services grows, question of industrial policy for services comes into play. There are three dimensions. One is services itself is creating a value chain. I will explain that. Second is services is supporting a lot of breaking down of manufacturing activities, fragmentation. The third one is manufacturing itself is translating to services. That's what servicification of manufacturing is. If you ask me a good example, and I love BMWs, I'm a BMW man, no? So I follow BMW very closely. And I drove a lot of cars, but I settled in BMWs. And all my students, my friends know this guy is crazy about that. So let me start a BMW story. So BMW made a big move just last week that to rival the Mercedes, that they're going to have a self-driving car space, and that was announced on Thursday. That's last week. And what BMW said was it's going to level up the 5-level driving and the option to purchase a driverless option. That means you have a car, you have an auto, then you can purchase the driverless service from them. So this is what we call manufacturing products. They introduce services. In fact, services give them more returns. Why? You have the customer coming back regularly back to them. So we are going to have driverless cars in cars itself as a service that's going to be provided. And the service itself is going to be driven by not 4G, by 5G. 5G technology is going to hit us. So that is interesting. And Toyota also announced that it's going to put in driverless cars in electric cars, driverless option. So again, that means all our cars will have services. This is what we call servicification of manufacturing activity. So the servicification of the economy is occurring, and servicification of manufacturing activity is also taking place. And that is challenging us in terms of thinking about trade, or even thinking about how theories of the firm will be, how exchange will take place, and how to train people to think about this. At the same time, structural adjustments are shifting. Economy is shifting to services, and traditionally we think the services are slow technology. But imagine a driverless car, the kind of technology that's going to have in services, which means that services is going to bring a lot of productivity growth into the economy and into the global value chain itself. And we're going to see this in financial services, e-commerce, accounting services. I will give an example. And within this dimension, services and servicification is also affecting serious social effects and labor market impacts. Employment, the type of jobs we create, the creative destruction is taking place at the occupational level. That means if we have more creation than destruction, that means good for us. But we're also observing more destruction than creation itself. I will also discuss these two dimensions in a little bit. So the distribution of this growth that ADB and IMF and World Bank saying robust growth is not translating to the distribution of wealth. So again, this is challenging us, the trade economies themselves, to think about not just talking about openness, but talking about sustainability and inclusive growth, which is again part of the sustainable development goals. Importance of human capital, how we're going to adjust institutions, and even how SMEs are going to participate in this servicification activities itself. So that itself is going to be very interesting, how we're going to adjust the new global environment. Okay, so I'm an evidence-based economist, so I will show you evidence. As you can see, the orange bar is rising. Again, orange bar is rising, so that is very important for us across all countries itself. And again, the orange bar is rising, services are growing because the way we break down our activities. So when the 70s and 80s, when Japanese start coming to us and putting us the flying geese strategies or whatever, it comes in a lumpy big investment. So when you get lumpy investment, policies are easy to design. That means I know what investment I bring in. That's what EDB does in Singapore. Bring lumpy investment. It comes and stay there for 10 years because it's difficult to move. I work on the human capital strategy to support that. So fairly it's stable. No? So in the second stage unbundling, what we did after the global financial crisis is start moving all the production around because a lot of liberalization was going on. Transportation costs came down because mass number, we can move a lot of things in a massive way. Containers are very big, transaction costs came down. Aviation free up, free trade agreements free up, borders become more borderless. So we start breaking down, businesses start breaking down the production. But the interesting part of the breaking down is the colors remain the same, but the arrows grow very fast. This is what you call service linkages. So we need services to move things across. Logistic services, accounting services, and aviation services. Everything start growing very, very fast. Again, that is good for us and easy. When this breakup takes place, it's easy for most countries to participate in the value chain. So everybody can participate. No? But participation in ASEAN is fairly coming to a standstill now. Why? Our cost of production rising up, human capital is rising up. So now we are talking about how to position ourselves in the value chain, how to move up the value chain. So this is where the issue of middle income trap is hitting us, how to go up the value chain. And when services are growing very fast, I also need to optimize my service sector. So the twin engine of growth within manufacturing and services becoming very thin now because now services become bigger. Again, which means that our chance of probability of country like Malaysia and Thailand and to be trapped in a middle income is getting higher and higher unless we start thinking about the new economic strategy. It might be 4.0 industrial strategy, but that 4.0 is a small part of the overall industrial strategy, I think. Okay? So what we have complex networks appearing, complex networks. So you can see that two forces are taking place. So within countries, we are experiencing what we call agglomeration effects. Agglomeration means we want to bring things together. Spillovers taking place. When spillovers takes place, people learn faster. And we want lumpy investment for agglomeration to take place. That's where the theory is based on. Huh? But at the same time, technology, information technology is also dispersing production. So we're losing production. At the same time, we're trying to keep things together. And that has been Singapore's and Malaysia's industrial strategy with respect to foreign workers. The other foreign workers is to keep the agglomeration effects, that's where industrial policies are, and manage defragmentation, particularly in the manufacturing. But we came to a point that we cannot hold to the manufacturing because the cost of production is going up fast. So businesses still fragment faster. And foreign workers also create social dimensions, social costs. When the social cost rises from a political point of view against this holding this agglomeration returns, then politicians tend to take the count the social costs, like in Singapore, start closing the border. Okay, so what is the next one in servicification is an example of a value chain itself. This is the value chain. And this value chain is very interesting, purely in accounting. So fairly accounting students, finance students should be aware of this. So there's the high level, the strategy part, where high level accountants work on. Then there's the judgment intensive part, where the blue component. The last part is the green one. Green one is, again, very systemic, very, easy to do kind of activities. So very transaction intensive and need a lot of accuracy and so on and so forth. And this is purely based, and the way accounting firms now, what they're doing is they're breaking down activities based on, not on skills. This is based on task that they're going to do. So this is what happening in accounting firms. And this is not driven by policy and institution. This is driven by returns and technology. And automation is taking place. And in particular, robots are taking over this. And what is robots going to take away in accounting? Just like a driverless car. Artificial intelligence is going to take place. So you're going to have a lot of drivers out of job. I'm not talking about 10 years, no, because they're going to introduce in 2020, 2023, so in another 3 years' time. So all those middle income taxi drivers will be displaced. So what are we going to do? Those are the social dimensions that's coming into play. We haven't thought of that. Policymakers are getting a bit, they do not know what to do. Because a good example is robots are taking over the software part. The green part is going to go. Previously what we did, India actually benefited from the green part. We transferred that to India to do because labor was cheaper. That's what part of the services fragmentation was. But now we are not going to do that. Developed countries are just going to give the robots to do. Robots are going to do this, the low end, because they say it's very accurate. They can go to don't know how many decimal points. Human beings only can go to that decimal point, you know. So they're interested in that decimal points. The other thing that LDCs are worried about, automation and robotics is not only going to take these green jobs away, there might be a reversal of jobs. All these jobs that have been outsourced to LDCs like Cambodia and Laos, all the sewing, cutting and pasting, robots might reverse this, and all this might reverse back to developed countries. That means it's not going to move down the value chain. They're going to put in technologies, just 3 robots is going to do 100 people's job or whatever. It's going to reverse back to the developed countries. If that happens, LDCs are out of the value chain itself. So again, how robots and how artificial intelligence is going to affect is going to be very interesting to see. So this is what we call disruptive technologies. So what is disruptive technologies? And there's 2 parts to it. The trade and technology, in terms of how growth is taking place, is very linear and very, what you call iterative. Then we one platform against the other. So when Apple introduced Apple 4, Apple 5, Apple 6, now they have iPhone X, it's all iterative, one platform or the other. So businesses understand this. And that's why linear path is coming in. Growth is, we say, is very robust. GDP real growth is very robust. Why? It's all linear. Businesses want that. But the impact of this on welfare is very uneven. So when you have lumpy investment in the 70s and 80s, impact of this technology was fairly even because social policies and the way we put in policy, develop human capital, and how wages increase was fairly even. But with this new kind of technology is coming in, the pace showing us is not very linear. That means the correspondence between the growth we have translate to the social impact in terms of how wages is going to grow, how people are going to grow, how standard of living is going to grow within an economy and across countries are going to be, it's not linear. There's not, the correspondence is getting thinner and thinner over time, which means that there are greater impact on older workers, semi-skilled workers, unskilled workers, and there's also a widening wage gap that's going on in the region. So again, it's nice to see the robust, but again, the other part, we are having a lot of challenges. Average educational level after 20 years of growth or 15 years of growth in Cambodia and Laos is still at primary school or below primary school. That's ASEAN. ASEAN is growing, you have a lot of robust growth, but it's still, that is not enough to position ourselves in the value chain itself. Creating the question of sustainable and inclusive growth. And because of this, policies are shifting inward. So every country you see, so most of the ASEAN countries is coming for election. So Indonesia will come for an election, and Malaysia and is coming for election. So the countries are coming for election, but fairly for Indonesia, the network says that Jokowi will still come back to power. There's not going to be any serious change in any political economy itself. But policies are going inward. Policy going inward is not purely because of institutional reasons, but more of this trade and technology impact that is the level of openness is affecting us. So in Singapore, we are moving inward and we close the foreign worker and try to control and start working on the social policies. So when you move to social policies in Singapore, you increase all the indirect tax. Last year, they increased the water tax, electricity tariffs. This year, they already announced they're going to move the GST from 6 to 9% to support a lot of social policies, training, and so on and so forth. And issues like human capital, education, how you're going to educate people, soft and hard infrastructure is going to be very critical for us. And we're going to see more inward dimension appearing in ASEAN itself. Okay. So let me quickly say a few things what this unbundling thing is about. So at least we have some dimension of this. So there is connectivity and innovation, and the first unbundling is mass production, lower transportation costs, and easy for us to participate in that value chain. Second part is information communication revolution. Communication costs went down, ideas moved, production was unbundled. The third stage, unbundling, is very interesting. No? Everybody have an iPhone. I can see everybody's taking picture iPhone. That iPhone is connecting us to a lot of equipments. That means it's linking us face-to-face activities are increasing very fast. So the first stage, unbundling, businesses go to consumers. This is what you call B2C. The second stage, unbundling, the service linkages is because B2B. The service linkages grow, intermediate good moves, so B2B activities increase. The third stage, unbundling, we expect B2B and C2B effects is going to increase very fast. Customize product. BMW is going to customize according to your preference. C dictates what B wants to do. So the C2B, social media, technology we have is all going to change the other way. That dimension, no policymakers have ever thought of. We have to go from C to B. But it increased opportunity for a lot of SMEs to participate in the C to B activities. So that is going to be very interesting to see how we're going to manage the C to B activities itself. So young people should start working on this kind of dimensions, I think. This is where the theory of the firm, trade, and exchange, and new ideas have to be developed. So I'm again evidence-based person, so I will show you, sorry about the small numbers. So I will tell you where the countries are. Singapore is right at the end, that is very high in the second stage unbundling. And Malaysia is right, the fourth from the right, from the left after Singapore. So fairly the unbundling, we are there. And then the first stage unbundling is Cambodia, Laos. You know. But if you say that, recently I had a discussion with Professor Fukunari Kimura. I work very closely with him, so he's the GVC person. So we are discussing, and his idea is the third unbundling is only occurring, will go start, or already started only 2015. My argument to him is already started in Asia. The third stage unbundling will be something like this. So this is Singapore's growth over 50 years, and we are so proud. I just put out a book, 50 years of growth, seeking new growth path. Singapore is seeking new growth path. So our industry has been deindustrialized. We are losing momentum in pharmaceutical, chemical, and electronic industry. And that they already know, 10 years ago, they already know they're going to lose. So they cannot hold on to that yet. So now services are growing. So the first stage is before the Asian financial crisis, or 1985. That big chunk we got is when Japanese came and invested big chunk. When you get a big chunk of growth for 20 years, industrial policy easy to manage, target, easy to develop human capital, infrastructure. Second bundle is what you call strategic investment, where growth moderated below the double digit, no? Just like what China is doing. So again, we strategically invested. Chemicals, pharmaceutical, and electronics, strategically invested, still get a lumpy. Why? We invested in science parks and so on and so forth. Then comes the global Asian financial crisis. Asian financial crisis completely changed the way we're going to do business. New business models appear, and which means that it's difficult to invest in a particular technology because of fragmentation. So we need agglomeration strategies to create lumpiness. So agglomeration allows us to keep the technology and create the robust growth. So what we have lumpy components. There you can see different, after Asian financial crisis, the growth itself become very, very fragmented at the end. That means growth become stronger, more volatility in growth, but on average, it's going to be around 2 to 3%. So every time it goes down and come back, it creates creative destruction. The destruction is more than creation. More workers have been displaced. More workers in the middle age, 45 to 50 has been displaced. Story says, and I've done this work, very difficult to bring them back to the world job market. But their household expenditures are highest for that group. Mortgage, you have $1 million house or $700,000 house. You have to pay until you die. And second is your kids are in school, teenagers. So once you displace, and very difficult to bring them back. And in fact, our professional managers and so on, when they're displaced at that age, they never recover the income. So there is a deep structural adjustment in the lifetime income, which means that they need to work a longer period of time. If not, our intergenerational transfer of human capital become very tricky. So then, which means that our fragmentation is also driven by privatization. You privatize everything. So again, our gross capital investment goes down very fast because you need to find lumpy investment in services. Very difficult to find lumpy investment in services. Which means that our productivity, you can't hold to productivity because every lumpiness gives you some productivity. You train them, you keep them, but in fragmentation, you can see, and this is pure evidence. I'm not cooking up the data. It's just calculating labor output per worker. And you can see every time there's a downturn, everything you have in productivity disappears. Then every time you go up, you have some productivity. Every time it goes down, it disappears. That means to hold on to a worker, it becomes very challenging for us. Which means that hold on to productive worker is even become challenging for us. It's purely driven by technology itself. So Singapore is already in the third stage of unbundling. That's what it means. Already in the third stage of unbundling. Which means that businesses are not going to wait for us. Businesses are already going ahead. Accounting services are breaking down. Financial services are going to blockchains. Financial services are moving ahead. They are going to move ahead. So policies are catching up with trade. Policies are catching up with businesses. We are moving into that phase now. Whereas in the 70s and 80s, businesses are catching up with policymakers. So that becomes an interesting dimension for us, how we want to think about this. No? So Malaysia. This is Malaysia, the blue line, going up very fast is services. Manufacturing already start going down from 2004. So you already have certain sense of deindustrialization already occurring. You know the reason why it's occurred faster in Singapore than Malaysia? The reason is Singapore is a city. It's a city. So fragmentation like this, if you just compare KL to Singapore, you're going to see that. But because Malaysia is much more bigger, the fragmentation is not as severe, not intense as what we observe. But because of the city, the impact of this become much more greater. Which means that we can put whatever money we want to improve productivity is going to be a big challenge for us. So the question is, where am I going to put the money during high level of fragmentation has become important. And again, this is important. Services drive growth. And services drive employment growth. So when you see this kind of fragmentation, again, how employment is going to grow become an important challenge for us. So this is what the future is going to be. So you translate to now what we need to do. And this is Malaysia. So the lumpy investment you have is getting smaller and smaller over time. Which means that fragmentation is going to start occurring soon. And this is not driven by It's purely going to be technology. It's going to be purely services. It's going to break down activities very fast. Okay, so disruptive technologies, there are two types. Information technology, artificial intelligence, or what you call Industry 4.0, is likely to reduce the number of tasks and going to create concentration forces, agglomeration. Communication technology, smartphones and so on, is to link up distances, which means that it will create dispersion forces. So the two forces is going to be very critical for us, how we're going to manage. Whether you want to manage the agglomeration or you're going to manage the dispersion. So this is going to be interesting. Newly developed countries actually capture the dispersion force. That's the second bundling. So they're able to link up pretty fast. So we want agglomeration. So in services, still looking for agglomeration policy in services, it's going to be very, very tricky for us. I haven't seen any policy, industrial policy, that's talk about agglomeration in services. So again, it's very important. Are there agglomeration effect in services? Still we're not sure. Quickly, I'll finish this as my last slide. Balancing agglomeration effects with dispersion effects are very critical for our next stage of growth. I'm not talking about long-term growth. I'm talking about the next 5 years. How are you going to balance this? Because education, how you're going to create human capital is going to be very critical, which means that education is a flow. And most of our industrial education strategy is to educate people when they're young. And we believe they will be there in their job forever. But there's no correspondence between education to occupation. And that correspondence, because of this fragmentation, is getting thinner and thinner, which means that we need a different strategy of educating young people when they're young. That means we need to think of giving them a portfolio early now. So there are strategies and work being done that the more I give when they're young, that means double degree, double major, and so on. An accountant is an economist, an engineer is an MBA. When you give early stage and compress the education, the better they're able to hold a fragmentation effect and the better able to move the job. And those stays in the same occupation, same job, recover their income. Those who move across, they don't recover the income. And those within the older age, very difficult to recover the income. So this is the real dimension coming from robust growth to where we're going to see things. So how to create this is going to be an important educational strategy. And how to move workers from a skill base, that means I call myself an engineer, I call this my skill. How to move to do task that is like accounting kind of task. And the guy who's going to do the task, his income is going to grow very fast. So there will be underemployment and overemployment. So the overemployment will be the guys who are able to do all the tasks. They're going to increase a lot of their income. Underemployment is those guys who are not trained to do any of these things. Mismatch. So the question is, how are you going to manage the underemployment with overemployment? Is going to be very interesting to see. So again, need further services liberalization, and we are talking about new age FTAs. Current FTA is only to manufacturing, so new age FTA is going to hit us. And how we're going to manage this have to be done through the regional FTAs, I think. So with that, let me close this. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Shandre, for a very comprehensive treatment of the very challenging trends and exciting opportunities as well, presented by trade as well as technology development in this region. Now, for the last speaker, our panelist, our president, Prof. Wu, he said he will stop at 6 o'clock, and now it's 6 o'clock. So without further ado, I'm pleased to invite Professor Wu. He's the founding president of Jeffrey Chia Institute.
Good evening. Our moderator started the session by telling us what a great year 2017 has been. And for Malaysia in particular, 2008 looks very good given the big increases in export. And this optimistic picture was boosted further by Shandre, who reminded us that 2007 was indeed a big improvement over the previous period, and 2018, according to the ADB, is going to be at least as good, if not better. So what does smart money say? Smart monies in the form of Goldman Sachs tell us that 2008 will surely be better than 2017. In fact, the title of the report is As Good as It Gets. It tells us, the small print that is hard to read, basically says that if growth was 3.7% for the world in 2017, in 2018, it will be at least 4%. This was a prediction that was made in the end of 2017 by Goldman Sachs. Well, businessmen, of course, generally tend to be optimistic because of something to sell. So let's see a more objective organization like the International Monetary Fund, and that's what's their prediction. Their prediction for 2018 is that it would be an improvement over 2017, from 3.6 to 3.7. Small improvement, but an improvement nevertheless. Where is that growth in the world going to come from? Let's look at the largest, most important economic countries in the world. The United States is predicted to go from 2.18 to 2.34. The European Union is expected to decline. Japan is expected to decline quite precipitously, and China is expected to decline. So what this says is the reason why the world growth is going to occur is that a large part of it comes from the growth in the US in 2018, and the US being a very important part, large part of the global economy. The rest of the growth would have to come from the emerging markets, because you look at the big, rich, advanced nations in the European Union and Japan, they are not going to grow as fast. So the only way that the world could grow faster in 2018 is partly from the US and partly from the developing world. So let's look at the developing world, specifically in Malaysia. We see that Malaysia, according to the IMF, is going to go from 5.4 to 4.8, Thailand from 3.7 to 3.5, but Indonesia will do well, the Philippines will do well. What is this shows? It means that the poorer part of the developing world is going to do the growing. The richer part of the developing world is not going to grow as well as before. Why? Largely because the richer parts of the developing countries, like Malaysia and Thailand, in order for them to grow, they must move up the value-added chain. But if they do not succeed in moving up the value-added chain, they cannot grow any faster than what they did the last period. Whereas in Indonesia and the Philippines, they are at very low parts of the value-added chain. So it's easier for them to move to the next stage. Because for Malaysia to move to the next stage, it will not be the next stage of manufacturing, but you have to move to research and design and in financing and distribution. That is where the next part of the value chain for us is. Whereas for Indonesia and Philippines, they could still move up in the production value chain, in the manufacturing segment of the value chain. So let us think about what is going to happen in 2018, given the fact that these projections by Goldman Sachs and by the IMF were made at the end of 2017. I'm going to argue that whatever you think the 2018 figure was at the end of 2017, you should now revise it downwards. You should revise it downwards largely because they have the emergence of developments since 2018 began that tends to lower growth for the rest of 2018, and for the emergence of a long-run trend that tends to drag growth lower. First, let me talk about the short run, why it would tend to be lower than what you think. Well, the big happy news early this year was that there's not the teaming up of the North and Korean team. So there's going to be no war. So that would certainly boost business confidence and hence business investment. Because growth has to be driven by an expansion in production capacity, which means that there has to be investment, the creation of jobs. Now, that should be positive for growth, the first development. The second development, Shandre in particular said TPP is saved because traditionally shy Japan has stepped up to the front to mobilize the rest of the people to agree to sign the TPP, to sign an agreement next week in Chile. Well, so given the fact that it's not going to break down in trade, that should be good for investment and that should be good for growth. And one of the news that has hit us recently is that Xi Jinping is now more likely to be leader for life than before 2018 appeared. How should this affect our prediction of Chinese growth, given how important of the Chinese economy is? Let's go back and look at what was predicted for China. China is predicted to grow at 6.5%. That's what Li Keqiang just announced 2 days ago. One thing about China is that the actual growth rate has always come up higher than the target growth rate, except for 2 years, during the Tiananmen years, which was an unexpected interruption in the Chinese political situation. The Chinese always, the reason is, if you announce a target to be this, and every time it's higher, it just shows your great ability in economic management. Unlike many countries which cannot perform, they announce higher targets that could be achieved, and then you blame it on bad weather, foreign imports, and so forth. So, 6.5. So is it likely to be higher than 6.5? If it is higher than 6.5, that means that China's contribution to global growth rate will be higher. This is good for China in the short run, but definitely terrible for China in the long run. If China sticks to 6.5 or lower, then that is good for China in the long run, although not in the short run. Because what China needs now is the next round of reforms, which means serious attention to the large state-owned enterprise system. They are soaking up resources that could be used more productively. In order to address the state enterprise problem, Xi Jinping would have to keep the state enterprises from continuing to expand their investments. Just look at the steel production capacity in China. The capacity utilization rate of steel in China is 60%. The capacity utilization rate of cement is around 60% too. and what is happening, these are two of the sectors that are still increasing their investment in capacity. Basically, growth happens because they are investing in a lot of garbage that will harm the economy growth in the long run. So, if the reason for Xi Jinping's becoming president for life is that he can do the hard task of taking the state enterprise to task, then that will have high growth for China in the future. If that staying in power for life means just a promise to reform but no implementation of the agenda, then China is not going to be an engine of growth for the rest of the world in the future. Now, come to the more important shocks that has hit the world, which is that the Brexit negotiations are stuck, and if anything, the situation in Europe looks worse, because the election results of last night in Italy suggest that the European project is under greater threat than before. Would there be a united Europe bargaining with Britain, or would there be a fractured Europe bargaining with Britain, and Italy that sees an option in leaving in the future? Because after all, what is the ideal trade arrangement for the United Kingdom as they see it? It is not to remain in the UK, but to be the free trade partner of the United States. That's what the Brexit camp envision to be its engine of growth. And this is why when Obama tried to persuade the Brits not to vote for Brexit, he said that the UK at the end of the line when it comes to negotiation for free trade partnership. And what has Trump said? Trump has now said, I support Brexit and I'll sign a free trade treaty with you. And not only do I want to sign a free trade treaty with the United Kingdom, we want to put tariffs on the other members of the EU. Because when you look at the 25% steel tariff that Trump has imposed, only 20% of US steel imports are from China. The other 80% are from Europe, Japan, Korea. 10% tariff on aluminum. Less than 20% of US aluminum imports are from China. Most of it is from Canada and the EU. So, what has Trump done? Trump is threatening a global trade war. And if we are lucky, nothing will come out of it. And if we are sensible, definitely nothing would come out of it. But we don't know whether we will be lucky or sensible. So what would a businessman do? What is it that you must invest today that you cannot invest 2 years from now or next year? Investments will be postponed, naturally, given this uncertainty. Postponement of investment would mean a slowing down of growth. That's what it is. So, even if nothing happens in this trade war, we don't know how it plays out, the negative impact on the investment would be high, in my opinion. It will be high enough to offset all the too good feeling items you see above. The decline of a probability of war in Korea and possible protection of survival of free trade in TPP-11. If the United States were to persist in putting tariff, the survival of TPP-11 is meaningless. That would be small. Now, how does the United States conduct its monetary policy? The United States conduct its monetary policy for the benefit of the American people. Not necessary, and if it happens to benefit the world, so much the better. But the only primary consideration is to benefit the people. It is said that given this uncertainty on trade, that the Federal Reserve would not dare to raise interest rates. I would say the rise in interest rates is inevitable, largely because we don't know if a trade war would happen, but we know for sure the tax cut has happened. So you just have a big blast in government stimulus, and that has to be offset because the unemployment rate in the US is at an all-time low at 4%, a phenomena that has shown that macroeconomists have been wrong for the last 20 years. That most of the Nobel Prizes won by macroeconomists, Milton Friedman, Robert Lucas, were all wrong, largely because they were all won on the basis of what the economists call the natural rate of unemployment. Now what we have shown is that there's nothing natural about the natural rate of unemployment, because unemployment rate is 4% and inflation is not anywhere near the horizon. And given the fact that Shandre has said that the Federal Reserve, or was it Shandre or you? The Federal Reserve, the new Federal Reserve head is a hawk. Given this bust, this tax cut that has occurred, interest rates would surely rise. And for that, it's highly unlikely, and given the delay in investment in the US, it's unlikely that the US economy would grow as fast as the IMF has said. All of these short-term things that I talked about are actually manifestation of a much longer trend, of much larger phenomena that is occurring. The phenomena of the turning away of globalization. I think that when Shandre talks about how fragmentation in production is going to drive us to higher prosperity, I want to talk about the fragmentation of international political economy that's going to drive out globalization, of which the absence of globalization would mean that there can no longer be fragmentation of production. What is happening? One of the big ideas in economics was a path-breaking book by Charles Kinderberger analyzing why the Great Depression occurred. We all hear about the Great Depression is because the US stock market, this is where, the best part of any panel is the open discussion. So let me abbreviate what I was going to say by saying what is happening in the world is the days of one powerful global leader coordinating the world in response to big shocks are over. Kinderberger says, for global stability, you need one big leader. Why? Because in a time of instability, that leader must be big and strong enough to keep its market open so that the rest of the world can sell to it. And at the same time, the leader has the financial resources to lend money to the rest of the world to stabilize it. When an instability happens, someone must be there to stabilize it. And that someone has to be big enough to do it. According to Kinderberger, before 1900, there was one country in the world who could do it. That was the United Kingdom. Now we think of UK as this country at the corner of Europe. To show you how big and powerful England was in 1900, is that if you look at the map of the world and you ask yourself, in the 100 years between 1800 to 1900, which country has England not attacked? Well, the number ranged from 9 to 15. It was so powerful, it kept everybody in line. So when Britain said, 1, 2, 3, we expand together, they all expanded together. But when the global financial crisis happened, the UK was unable to do that task anymore because it was no longer a big major country. The United States was 50 times larger than the UK in 1929. But the United States didn't have the mentality to be a global leader. It was only after World War II was over, the United States chose to play the role of the global hegemon. But today, the global hegemon is gone because first we have China just as big. And will China be the new global hegemon? No way. Because India is going to be big. So the world is going to be one of multipolar world. In that sense, global stability is not guaranteed. What is even more important is that in a world of multipolar world, the natural division of the world is spheres of influence. Spheres of influence can lead to deglobalization. We would have to be able to be sensible enough to resist the degeneration of the world in the sphere of influence. But we are seeing it. What you see in the Ukraine, what you see in the South China Sea, China pushes ASEAN to propose RCEP, and the United States quickly replies with TPP. Then China raises the stake with One Belt, One Road. All of these are instruments of competition among the big powers. So the natural outcome of sphere of influence is that each of the sphere is basically have a big brother who could be generous or who could be oppressive. But regardless of what the outcome is, global progress would depend on these spheres of influence to be able to work together to maintain an open global trading system, open regionalism, and also to fight climate change and to prevent nuclear proliferation. So given the fact that we are moving to a multipolar world, whether we will continue to have high economic growth in the future would depend on the multipolar world being able to arrive at an international economic architecture that would preserve an open trading system. So let me stop here, and we would have your reaction to what we have said. Thank you.
Okay, I have two questions. I'm Jonathan Dason, an intern at the Penang Institute. So the first will be directed to Professor Ariff, then the second one will be directed to Professor Wu. So the first question that I have for Professor Ariff, I want to know if there is a correlation between the stability of a particular currency versus the developmental state of a country. For example, if a country undergoes a developmental state where it's experiencing rapid growth, should the currency be stable, if at all? To Professor Wu, my question would be, is there a natural rate of global integration? If you look at many periods, for example, the United States itself, it has gone through a period of inward looking and then outward looking, inward looking again. So if you extrapolate it to a global context, I'm a student of international relations, do we see a pattern of integration and disintegration? Here I would mean that there is a certain limit to which the world can integrate at any one time. And can we figure that? Is there a way for us to figure that out?
Thank you very much, Professor Thye. I think we've had an excellent discussion and presentations by the panelists. My reaction would be, we know the problems, or we think we know the problem. Uncertainty, fragmentation, disruption. But what are the solutions, This is where I think academics fail. When they pose the problems but don't talk about the solutions. So what are the solutions the panel can list out? 1, 2, 3. And let's be encouraged that there's some hope rather than leave this place with a depressing feeling that all is lost. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. The answer is yes. If you look at the long-term trend of countries that have gone to higher development stage, they all had stable currencies. A recent example will be that of Singapore, but it's a special case. But let's look at some of the countries that moved from, say, low-income status to middle income. Turkey is an example, before the current government came into power. That was entirely based upon stabilizing the currency. So there are country studies that suggest that these two go together. But this is a long-term thing. In the short term, you can be out of gear, but the long term is very important, the convergence, what I call the speed of adjustment to long term. Some countries have got higher speeds. As I mentioned earlier, within 6 months, they can adjust to a crisis. Some countries take much longer time, the speed of adjustment. Unfortunately, some of the countries I showed, the 10 countries, Turkey, for example, Malaysia, for example, very slow adjustment. That means the instability is so high that they do not actually gain control of stability. Turning to Tan Sri's question, I hinted in my speech that several countries have managed to stabilize currencies. Monetary policy has, since 1984, prior to 1984, was based upon money supply control. But after 1984, particularly after Milton Friedman's work, they started targeting inflation. But few countries like Switzerland, Singapore, and there are 2 other countries in East Asia, China, during the period when high inflation was, they use currency and sterilization as 2 methods to stabilize the currency and inflation. So in Malaysia, as Prof. A pointed out, these are the 3 devils. They go in opposite direction. How do you fine-tune them to work together is a big challenge. But some countries have been very successful. So the solutions are there. You're right, we did not elaborate on that. Perhaps that's a weakness in my presentation.
Do you really have faith in the academics? I myself sometimes doubt it. No? The reason is this. The reason is there is a dichotomy between what academics have been doing and how the economy has been growing. This is a critique to my own profession itself, economists. Because from the 80s and 90s and going to the 2000 and even global financial crisis, do you know that the Queen asked the royal economists, how come they didn't predict if so many Nobel Prize winners? The reason is we have shifted a lot to theory and start working on publication rather than addressing real issues itself. And that's where the real part of the economics are. So in the 70s and 80s, when we start reading all, like Professor was talking about Kindleberger and so on, when you read the way they write and the way they address the social issues was very, very important. There are economists, we're trying to address this, some of them, but most of them are still living in the enclave and so on. So going back to the question of optimism itself, optimism actually starts with pessimism. And that is very important for us. If you don't recognize where the optimism is coming from, that is pessimism, you will never get the optimism itself. So that's the interesting part of economics itself. Economics is able to identify in an evidence-based way where policymakers are not addressing the key issues. So most of us in the 70s and 80s, even now, talk about openness and trade and so on and so forth. And we know it creates sustainable growth. Theory actually says that. We all write all this theory and so on and so forth. But interestingly, new studies are emerging that sustainable growth is not enough. We need inclusive growth. So the question is how to create inclusive growth is become important. That means everybody is going to go inward, like what Prof Wu was talking about, and to rationalize this strategy so that we get the highest social return as much as economic return. So the dimension that's appearing now is fragmentation is going to be driven by businesses and technology. And when we talk about blockchains, e-commerce, driverless cars, space technology, drones, and so on, how many of us here actually understand any of this, including policymakers? They don't understand because they don't understand the technology itself, which means there's going to be attraction back to rationalize this technology so that we can minimize the social impact. That's what they're trying to do. So it's not a pessimism to me. It's actually an enlightenment that people should be aware of this, rather than to assume that policymakers are always right or the academics are always right. So the idea of this is to present in an evidence-based way and also to give policymakers where the gaps they need to fill up so that we get the highest return, not only from an economic point of view, but from a social point of view. That's what has been highlighted. How are we going to create human capital is going to be very critical for us. It's not that traditional way of teaching somebody, it's not going to work now. Because that is what Singapore has been doing for the last 50 years. And we came to a standstill, realized that it's not working because the structural unemployment is occurring for PMETs, professionals, managers, and technicians. We spend a huge amount of money. So the question is, policies have to be dynamic, keep shifting. And that dynamism in policy is very important. That means it must be forward-looking. Most of our policies now is all backward-looking, still working on the traditional way of thinking. So this is where new ideas have to come, and new ideas have to come from young people. New ideas have to come from how people's behavior is going to change, how e-commerce is going to work. Young people are moving ahead. Businesses are moving ahead. Their behavior is changing. So are we going to regulate them or are we going to let them liberalize? It's a pure policy question. And end of the day, politicians and policymakers are driven by what people say. That's what the median voters are. So if the median voters don't react, then political economy will change. So there is a feedback effect going to take place. So the idea is to present this not from a pessimism point of view, to reach the optimism. If you don't understand your failure, you will never understand your success. So that's where the direction of the... So to me, this is not pessimism. It's actually very interesting to me that we are going to move into a very interesting period of growth. So again, Prof. Wu's idea was the political economy itself. It's very interesting how the political economy balance the technology that's going to be driven by businesses and the political economy that's going to be driven, managed by the politicians themselves. So that is the balance that's going to be achieved in the future.
I think the best way to combine both questions is to start off with the line that there is no single silver bullet that would fix the problem of unable to get sustained economic growth. To get sustained economic growth, you need an international system that is conducive to growth, and then you need national actions that are able to take advantage of the positive international environment for growth. In other words, you have to act on two levels. When we talk about globalization, that is at the global level. That must occur in order for Malaysia to prosper. But it will not happen if Malaysia does not undertake fundamental reforms that are needed to move the country onto the next stage of growth, which has to be knowledge-led growth. Basically, we have to fix the education system. Our PISA score is very low, according to international comparison. And given how much money that the Malaysian government spends on education, compared to other countries, we are particularly low. We are not getting the results we deserve for the expenditure on the education system. Without good education, you cannot acquire technological skills and go up the next level. Even if you got a good education system, you got to have be able to retain the human talents to stay, and better yet, attract human talents to flow in. And even if you have the human talents, you still need the financial capital to finance the movement up the capital, the value-added chain. And that means Malaysia has the highest capital flight per capita in the world. We are the third largest in absolute amount in the world. The largest amount of capital flight in the world occurs in China. Second is in Mexico. Third is Malaysia. On a per capita basis, is $400 a person in China, $600 in Mexico, 2,750 for Malaysia. So the reason why we need foreign capital is not because our savings is so low, but because a lot of it has run out. And the other reason we need foreign capital is that many of them, the capital come in to bring in the technology, which we were unable to master on our own, but we need the foreign engineers to bring it. So we got to fix that. And of course, the reform of the state enterprise system. Our GLC, we have too many GLCs that are basically eating the lunch of the private industries. And that has to be fixed. And all of this has to be, the next government after the election will have the courage, our beloved Prime Minister or our beloved ex-Prime Minister, either one of them, will undertake the reforms that will have to drastically modify the new economic policy, sort of a framework that has guided economic policy. And of course, China is a whole list of different things. So the magic bullets in each country is different. But then the more important thing to make it work, like China would have never gotten so rich if not for the existence of its ability to sell to the rest of the world, to participate in the international division of labor. Like you pointed out, there have been movements in integration, reversals, movement forward again, and reversals. Every reversal has been a case of global recession. That is, so quite the thing is, where have we failed such that such reversals have occurred? Such reversals have occurred because we have not been able to deal adequately with some of in global governance. Like, for example, we got international organizations that don't work. When the IMF came here during the Asian financial crisis, they caused the larger crisis with the wrong policies. And the World Bank, in particular, started off with giving money for infrastructure construction, and then the money was spent on sending advisors to you to tell you how to run your policy. So that is why the Chinese have gone back to the basic, the ASEAN Infrastructure Investment Bank. You don't just tell people what to do, you enable them what to do with the infrastructure. But all of this comes back to integration is good, but if you define integration wrongly, then integration will be reversed. Like, for example, what integration now is defined as whatever that benefits the multinational corporations. Look at the state investor mediation mechanism. Basically, that removes, it reduces the sovereign rights of the state in bargaining between a country and the multinational company. Right now, who advises the US on every action that the US trade representative undertakes? It's the largest multinational corporations. Like, for example, the US pushes for trade liberalization means opening of the financial sector. Why? Because it's the US financial industry that is driving the US trade agenda. That's why the same emphasis on trade in services is good for you. Let the US banks come and take over the financial sector of these countries. So I think that we have to define what is integration correctly, and not in a narrow sectoral sense. That is why you have a revulsion against globalization. They see it as a loss of national sovereignty as well. And this is something that is quite undesirable. So that's why we have those reversals. And those reversals occurred not in terms of changing the meaning of integration, but in trade restrictions. But the trade restrictions are also not just reaction to the failures of globalization, but also to the changes in political economy, the distribution of political power in the world.
Everyone is yapping about Industry 4.0, and I'm still at third industrial revolution. So there was a very good book by Jeremy Rifkin back in 2011, and then he set up a lecture, it's an online lecture 3 weeks ago through Vice. It's a very good lecture. You have to spend 1 hour and 40 minutes about it, but it's really, really good. But what was highlighted there, he said, Industrial Revolution, second industrial revolution, which is after discovering of oil, car ownership, home ownership, is all based on home ownership, all about individual ownership. But the new sharing economy, which is happening now, and the new generation, they don't mind sharing. So my question is, when Napster starts in 1997, the whole production of music just went down, and it's happening now. Because consumers is going straight to consumers, content makers, right? So question is this the normal norm? Is it normal for multinationals not to happen anymore? And you have smaller amalgamate people that are actually working together towards a common goal?
Industrial 4.0 is based on digitalization and artificial intelligence. That is the key element of Industrial 4.0. But Industrial 4.0 is only a sub-part of the whole industrial plan itself. It only affects some aspect of the activities, particularly the services activity itself. And that's where the key element of technology itself is going to evolve. But there's two parts to it in terms of this evolution. One part is platforms, the other part is the application. One of the things the regulators are very worried about, policymakers are very worried about, that platforms might become a monopoly. Yahoo is going to be knocked out. There's going to be one platform. And that platform might be Google. Google is going to capture everything. And they're going to be what Prof was talking about, will be the element that's going to define the political economy itself. And how that platform is going to allow sharing will be very interesting to see. And how they're going to extract the rent from people from sharing is also very, very, very interesting to see. So we are still trying to figure out, should we have one single platform or multiple platforms, or the government should go in, or policymakers go in, and the region itself trying to create a platform to counteract that? Will be new dimensions that are appearing in terms of how to manage this. And this is growing too fast, even for policymakers to think about. So the question is whether small players are going to play around. Is the norm? It's interesting to see. It might be. But there are big technologies that are coming in where small players cannot play around. They need to understand. Blockchains, a good example. Space technology. So some technologies, small players will play around. But big technologies and how innovation is going to occur will be still driven by a little bit larger guys. That's one dimension. The other dimension is social media and how people are sharing. And that is again interesting. people are becoming very hungry for information. I agree with you. You are Industry 3.0. I'm Industry 2.0. I believe in agglomeration, trying to understand. But that, whether we believe or not, we will be left behind. We will be left behind. Why? Everybody here is holding an iPhone 6, now iPhone 8. You already been digitalized, whether you like it or not. That means social media and people-to-people interaction are taking place. Everything we eat, we put it digitalized, we send it out. Payment is going to be digitalized. People-to-people interaction is going to increase. So I want something to be done. I don't want to go to a business. I go and ask somebody to give me that service. So the way we're going to use money, the way we're going to interact is going to change. So we need to study this, how the theory of the firm. The question is a market structure kind of question. No? How C to B business and the C to C activities are going to change. It's going to be an interesting dimension in terms of even testing a lot of old theories, traditional theories, and how people are going to change. And people are going to move faster and faster. Productivity, you're not going to see a lot. Why? Businesses are extracting a lot of surplus from us. By law, you're only supposed to work 8 hours a day. By law. I can bet with you, everyone, including myself, have worked more than 8 hours a day. Payment is only made 8 hours a day. Work is done more than 8 hours a day. A lot of productivity is not captured. That is the norm in the new kind of environment. So we're going to work in a virtual environment. We're going to work a lot. So the guy who understands this and able to do different tasks is the guy who's going to become very, very rich in this new environment. How to break down his task and able to sell faster. And that task is going to do, if it's going to be high-end, that's where he's going to make the most money. Again, that is the norm, which means that there will be widening wage gap. Countries will be left behind. There will be reversal of... Robotics is going to take everything back again to developed countries. So all this value chain can collapse. So these are issues that we are trying to understand. So the question is, can we manage this? Maybe in the short run, but in the long run, it's very difficult. So the behavior of people is changing. Policy is only effective if you can understand the behavior of people. So a lot of policy you're putting in is not having no reaction because no understanding the behavior of young people. No? Election is a good example. No? The prediction of the Brexit, until the poll, we said that they will stay. But again, the polls were wrong. So again, we didn't understand the behavior. So again, these are interesting dimensions that are appearing. Even theories, economists, sociologists, all trying to figure this out, this new phenomena. So it's a very good question. So fairly, I think, answer your question because I myself are grappling with this from Industry 2.0.
We have a very wide-ranging presentations on different topics and areas. I won't attempt to make a summary or even share some key takeaways, but because of time constraint, let me invite all of you to join me in thanking our panelists for their wonderful insights. And have a good night.